Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming out to the Bexley Public Library. My name is Zach Parrish. I'm the programming librarian here. So before we get started, really quick, if you haven't already, please silent your phones. We don't want any, question and answer, hard-hitting journalist question, and then we're hearing a ringtone in the audience. So thank you for doing that. And then for our question and answer, for those who are attending in person, you notice that you have your index card and pencil on your seat. If you have any questions, please just write those down and pass them to the nearest aisle. For those on the aisle exits, big responsibility. Just hold on to those cards. At around 35 minutes into the program, we will be walking the aisles to collect those, and we will deliver them to our moderator, who will facilitate the question and answer up on stage. So please get thinking and write your questions down before the 30-minute mark. You also saw on your seats, but today is a hybrid program, so we have many people viewing from home as well over the live stream. So I just want to plug one program we have coming up this week, and to do so, I'm going to borrow a few words from our speaker today. So in his new book, On Freedom, Timothy Snyder writes, "The truth about your school board and your local politicians is not something that you will likely get by your own efforts. Not to mention the truth about campaign finance, bank bailouts, or foreign wars. The labor has to be social in the sense that communities make fact-finding possible and attractive for individuals. Factuality requires institutions, above all, investigative reporting. Ultimately, to resist the few big lies, we will need to produce millions of little truths." If that doesn't get you pumped up for local journalism, I don't know what will. Page 184. This Thursday, October 24th at 7 o'clock, we have a wonderful panel of local journalists. We have WOSU's All Sides host Anna Staver, the Ohio Bureau Chief of the USA Today Network, Anthony Shoemaker, and Laura Hancock, who covers politics and policy reporting from Cleveland.com and The Plain Dealer. So we hope you can, hopes to see some of you back this Thursday. And that is also a hybrid program, so you can join on the live stream if you're unable to make it to the library. So with that, welcome. I will turn it over to our fearless leader, our director, Ben Heckman.
Sir. I'm Ben Heckman, Bexley Public Library Director, and on behalf of the board, myself, and I think the community of Bexley, welcome to the library for those in person and online. We have a great program lined up. Big shout out and thank you to our incredible library staff for helping to pull all this together. And a big thank you to our local bookstore, the Book Loft, who are selling books right outside this door. At the end of the program, there will be an author signing. Just past those books, go up the stairs, and to your left, we'll be upstairs in the room for the book signing afterwards. So make your way there. We'll get plenty more room there for the autographs. So thank you for everyone for making this happen. Before I introduce our featured speaker, I'd like to say a few words about our distinguished moderator. Dr. Nicole R. Fleetwood is a writer, curator, and the Paulette Goddard Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU. She is a 2021 MacArthur Fellow and author of Marking Time, Art in an Age of Mass Incarceration, which won numerous awards, including the National Book Critics Award in Criticism. She is currently at work on a memoir entitled Between the River and the Railroad Tracks that is forthcoming from Little Brown Publishing. It's always good to introduce a native Ohioan, which isn't mentioned in the 2 or 3 page Yale introduction. So, native Ohioan Dr. Timothy Snyder is a Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. His books, which have been published in more than 40 languages, include Bloodlands, Black Earth, On Tyranny, The Road to Unfreedom, and Our Malady. His work has inspired poster campaigns and exhibits, sculptures, punk rock, rap songs, a play, and an opera. He has appeared in over 50 films and documentaries. His most recent book, On Freedom, has been called a brilliant exploration of freedom, what it is, how it's been misunderstood, and why it's our only chance for survival. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Snyder to the stage.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Thank you for taking part in this conversation. For my part, what I'm looking forward to is the conversation with Professor Fleetwood. What I thought I would do here in the beginning is to just give you a kind of high altitude version of what the book is, give you a notion of what the main argument is, and then together with Nicole, we'll have a chance to flesh things out, and then together with you, we'll have a chance to have some questions and some answers. The hardest part of this book, I think, is actually incredibly easy. The hardest part of this book is the answer to the question, are there good things in the world? Because I think there are. I think honesty is good, and I think loyalty is good. I think punctuality is good. I think spontaneity is good. So there are good things in the world, right? That's the single hardest thing. It's the hardest thing about freedom, is to admit that you think some things are good. To admit it. To accept that you actually love some things, you actually care about some things, that this is true about you. And not just to be a conformist and not just to bully other people. But then the thing is, once you accept that there are good things in the world, the next thing we have to deal with is the fact that these good things don't all go together in a natural way. So it's not that honesty is bigger or better than loyalty. They're just both good, and sometimes you have to choose between one and the other. So when I'm signing the books and you say, Professor Snyder, you look great, that could be honesty or it could be loyalty. Right? But it's not both. Likewise, punctuality is a good thing, spontaneity is a good thing, but if you're going to be spontaneous, you're going to be late for a lot of things. That's just the way it's going to go, right? Or to take a very serious example, mercy and consistency. We would all, I think, agree that mercy is a good thing, but to be merciful, you have to be inconsistent. And so a free person is a person who affirms values, combines values, makes judgments about values, moves through life creating a character on the basis of these choices made over time. So freedom's positive. It's positive in the sense that it rests on the good things, but it's also positive politically. Because if you've accepted what I've said thus far, then the next question would be, how do we become people who are like that? And of course, it's not easy, right? It's going to involve affirmations of things. That's very difficult. But it also has to involve creating the conditions so that people can grow up to be free. So generally, when we talk about freedom, we're imagining somebody who is already a self-sufficient, property-owning, generic, usually male, probably white person, right? We abstract away from all the things that went behind that person that allowed that person to be free. But in fact, if freedom is serious, we all have to grow up free. What are the conditions for that? And knowing what we know about child development, knowing what we know about other things, we know that little kids need a lot of time. We know that all of us need the right kinds of relationships. We know, and this is just such an easy one, but it's like hard for Americans. When you have a lot of vacation, you're actually a more free person than when you don't, right? Nervous laughter. Thank you for taking that cue. When you have 2 years of parental leave, you are a more free person than when you don't. You simply are. It's as simple as that. And so the things that we need to become free as individuals require work together as some kind of collectivity. And that's what government is for. The way we go wrong in this country is that we talk about freedom a lot, which is fine. But when we talk about it, we mean negative freedom. We just mean freedom from things. from oppression. And of course, that's very important. You have to be free from oppression. But the reason you need to be free from oppression is because you're you. The prison wall is a problem because of the person behind it. The barbed wire is a problem because of the person behind it, because of the person. And so when the wall is down, or the barbed wire is cut, there remains the question of what do we do to help that person to become who she or he or they are going to become, right? So freedom from is very important, but it's only important because of freedom to. It's only important logically because of freedom to. When we think of freedom as just being freedom from, we fall into this Hollywood image of me against the world, right? And the problem with that, aside from the fact that if it's you against the world, and I say this with some experience, you're always going to lose, if it's really, okay, awkward moment for Americans. But if it really is you against Godzilla, or you against the aliens, or you against all the Marvel villains, or whatever, you are in fact going to lose. You always lose when it's you against the world. But in this fantasy of, I see that's taking a while to sink in. But the deeper problem with the fantasy of freedom being about you against the world is this. It means that you never have to ask who you are. And freedom is about the things you think are good, right? And if freedom is always about you against the world, you never learn to use the pieces of the world that you have to learn to use to become tools. Not everything that seems like a barrier is a barrier. Some of those things are tools. But the most important part about, or the deepest thing which is wrong here, is that if freedom is just me against things, then it becomes very easy for me to say, well, one of the things that I'm against are other people. And so freedom being me against the world, freedom being negative, becomes us and them very quickly. Negative freedom shifts to fascism very quickly. So what I'm going to try to say, and I want to leave lots of time for me and Nicole to talk about this, is that there's a way to allow a lot of our problems to slip away. And part of it, of course, if we're going to allow negative freedom to slip away, part of it, of course, is recognizing that negative freedom comes from a certain place in history generally and in our history. There's a reason why people think the government is the only problem, right? Because in negative freedom in America, this is often called libertarianism or something. The government's the only problem. Now, for whom is that true? That is true for the person who has already assembled the land, the slaves, and the women. For that person, the government is the problem, right? For that definition of freedom, the government is the problem. And that is where negative freedom comes from. It has a trajectory. That's where it comes from. That's why it seems plausible in this country. And so one way to start unburdening ourselves of that, or at least understanding that, is to see that we have freedom wrong. And when we see that we have freedom wrong, we can start to think about why we have freedom wrong. But I want to suggest as well that if we get freedom right, a lot of the things which seem like terrible dilemmas in the United States begin to fall away. Like, for example, we have this terrible idea that freedom and government work against each other, and the only way to be more free is to have less government, which is childish, insane, and wrong. Government is legitimated by freedom. You cannot, in fact, be free without the right kind of government. That's the way the two things fit together. We have this idea in America, which is also terrible, childish, and wrong, that freedom and security must always somehow be sacrificed one for the other. But 99% of the time, they work together. If I can make you more secure, I can make you more free. And if I can make you more free, I can make you more secure. Where security, of course, doesn't just involve external threats. Security involves things like, where is my kid going to school? Where's my retirement pension coming from? Do the roads work? Do the trains work? That's all security as well. And then also a problem which I think falls away when we think about freedom this way is the problem of the future. Our politics, unfortunately, is very much without a future, not just in the US, but around the world. And that has a lot to do with negative freedom. Because if we think freedom is just me against some part of the world the way that it is, then I'm always right and the world is always wrong, but no thinking gets done about what kind of future there should be. We're locked into a permanent status quo. But if we think of freedom as positive, then suddenly the future opens up. And then finally, and now we're going to, I think maybe it's my job to introduce Professor Fleetwood again, because after this we're going to talk. But But finally, it allows us to slip out of this kind of confining American sense that there's a terrible tension between the individual and the collective. There doesn't have to be. If you accept that in order to become an individual, you need other people, then suddenly that tension doesn't seem so terrible. And if you can accept that one of the important purposes of collective action is to create the conditions for individuality, then suddenly that tension doesn't seem so terrible. And the fact that there are good things in the world seems a little bit more obvious. So that's where I began, that's where I'm going to end, and I'm looking forward to talking with Professor Nicole Fleetwood. Thank you.
So good afternoon. What an amazing crowd. And I have to claim Ohio. Mr. Heckman did not say that I'm an Ohio native. I'm 5 generations Black Ohioan from Butler County. And I'm delighted to be here with my fellow Ohioan friend and a scholar I deeply admire. So thank you for inviting me to be in conversation with you. Ohio, we're here together. It's a welcome home. And Ohio is at the center of your thinking, your inquiries about freedom. The history of Ohio as a place where religious and political utopian societies and communes were able to experiment with notions of freedom and possibility. Ohio being really important to the Underground Railroad. Ohio being a place where there were abolitionist communities, where you had communities of Blacks and whites pre-Civil War. But Ohio also being a place of entrenched housing segregation, employment discrimination. In the early 20th century, it was a hotbed for the KKK, right? So Ohio has this very complex relationship with these, and I'm rooting a notion of freedom also in thinking about discrimination and segregation. So, and I do want to get at like what are these overlapping relationships? So, can you just talk about Ohio and your childhood in Ohio as being so much a part of your theorization, your journey in this book? You talk about your childhood, it opens with your childhood, and there are many anecdotes about Ohio that runs throughout on freedom.
Mm-hmm. So let me start with the general and try to land on the specific. The most general point to be made here is that freedom is about recognizing your mistakes. If you can't recognize your mistakes, you're not a free person. If you think you're never making mistakes, that's because you're living inside somebody else's story. And if you're inside somebody else's story, you're not a free person. So this book is not written from thesis to thesis to thesis where I'm always right. It's very often laying out a moment where I didn't necessarily understand what was happening at the time, but later it became clear to me what was happening. And so childhood is important for that reason, because there are things that you learn or things that happen to you when you're a child, which are deeply important for your own freedom later on, and are deeply important for what kind of a country or what kind of a state you're living in. And so you have to return to those things and recognize when you were being programmed, or recognize when you got something wrong, or recognize that when you were in a moment, that moment might have been very different for somebody else who was in that same moment. And I'm trying to catch some of those moments in this book. Second level is childhood and freedom. I skipped over it here, but it's, I think, a really important point that if you care about freedom, you've got to care about childhood. And it's a deep sign of the problem of our discussion about freedom that we're always imagining an adult who somehow automatically has the conditions. So we don't talk about trauma, but also positively, we don't talk about what's needed, like what are all the things a kid needs to be able to do things I was talking about. Like if there are virtues in the world, that's great, but you have to be able to recognize them. You have to acknowledge them in other people. You have to learn from other people. You have to revere other people. You have to admire other people. And you have to be able to make hard choices, and that does not come automatically. the things you need to be free don't come automatically. And so that means a community has to somehow invest in all kinds of ways in children so that children have a chance to be free. And then with my own childhood, so this has to be very specific. So Nicole is from Hamilton, Ohio. Second ward of Hamilton, Ohio. I grew up in the south suburbs of Dayton in Centerville, Montgomery County, but my family is from and still resides in Clinton County, Ohio, so further south. And the book begins with a scene of me ringing a bell, and with the ideas, all the ideas that ringing a bell would bring to the mind of a 6-year-old child on the bicentennial. And it also includes a number of moments that are very Ohio moments involving things like school buses and swimming pools and public spaces where something was happening, but I didn't know exactly what was happening and didn't figure it out until later on. But I think you're right that, like, in some sense, both parts of Ohio are crucial, enabling to me to write this book, because when I was a kid, like, there were a lot of things I didn't understand, but on the other hand, I did have those abolitionists and those Quakers and so on in my back pocket. And so there was always this view a little bit from the outside on what was happening. I think that was important for me here.
In terms of childhood, reading your book, there's a scene around swimming. And it struck me because so much of my formative childhood, especially summers in Ohio, was spent swimming at a segregated swimming pool at the Booker T Community Center. It was the only space where the Black community actually could safely and with a welcome participate in recreational activities. If we went to any of the other spaces like the Boys and Girls Club, we almost always experienced some kind of racial animus. And you talk about this, your experience at a swimming club, and thinking about, well, what makes this a club, right? And it leads you later to think about the history of desegregation, desegregation and negative freedom, right? So can you talk about that? Like, and I'm curious about what's at stake in, a community or a group of people closing off their possibilities, like for recreation, because of fear that other people might be able to participate in that activity. So part of the history of the desegregation of public spaces like public swimming pools meant that communities across the country just closed their swimming pools and basically filled them off and cemented them, and it led to the privatization of swimming centers, which is something that Tim experienced as a child, not knowing at the time, not being able to quite know that this is the history of how the swimming club comes into being. And I'm learning to swim at a segregated community center that was really buttressed through the war on poverty, and that was given a lot of money through HUD and organizations that were charitable organizations. So can we, that we can see the kind of privatization of certain recreational areas, and then other areas being like charity cases, right?
So let me again, let me take a deep breath, and because I don't want to take too much credit for figuring anything out for myself. It was a long loop before I figured this out. And I want to share with you what that loop was, because I think it'll probably be relevant for some of you folks here in Bexley. It goes like this. If you're a historian of Nazi Germany, which I am, you are aware that the Nuremberg laws, Nazi racial legislation, borrowed from American Jim Crow. But even there, that can seem like a bit of an abstraction, because if you're white, Jim Crow can seem like a bit of an abstraction. So you can think, okay, they borrowed from Jim Crow, that's certainly very bad. And at some level you can say, well, of course, that means something for US history. but you have to push a couple steps further to see what it means for US history. And not all of the stuff which is relevant is in the law books. So for example, the Nazi period, the Nazi transition in Germany in the 30s had a lot to do with what we would call civil society or non-governmental organizations who were responsible for things like who could swim where in a river, who could swim where in a lake, or who could swim in a swimming pool. And it just happened, actually, without any legislation banning Jews from swimming pools or rivers. It, so to speak, just happened that all over Germany in those years, in the mid-30s, all over the whole country, organization after organization put up signs, got the Jews out of the swimming pools, got the Jews out of the nicer parts of the river. And so, Jews could go swimming, but maybe not in the nice part of the river, in some other part of the river. And I learned that and I knew that, but it still took, a couple decades for it to dawn on me that way of doing things had something to do with the way kids grew up in the US in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? Where the logic was, as Professor Fleetwood has already spelled out, the logic was after the Civil Rights Act and after some court decisions, all over the country, in Ohio, there are lots of examples of this as well, as I'm sure some of you know, municipalities would literally cement in their swimming pools rather than allow black folks to swim there. And that was part of a larger process in which my childhood was certainly certainly infected by, which was the creation of all white or nearly all white suburbs, white flight from the cities, and zoning of a certain kind. So such that, when I come into the world in 1969, there's a community which has been created in which there aren't going to be really any public facilities much at all, but there will be a private swim club, right? And coming into the world, that was the world, right? Like that was, so to speak, nature. And then the effect on bodies. I don't know where you were going with this, and follow up if I'm not thinking the same thing you are, but it's really, really important for freedom particularly. Superficially, and I remember this very well from being a kid, we were taught, or we were told, or it was common sense, that black people couldn't swim. That physically they couldn't swim, right? You remember this too. They physically couldn't swim because their bodies were less buoyant. That's what we were told. That was common sense. Everybody knew that, right? Everybody knew that. It was something that you knew. And so the social construction of difference becomes nature, right? It becomes what you think is actually true about nature. And then going a step deeper, the encounter with the body is really important for freedom. And I think this is one of the things that we get very wrong from the beginning, because when we think about the free person, it's not just that we're thinking about an abstract person, we're pretty much thinking about a disembodied person. And in fact, freedom at a pretty deep level has to involve the recognition of the other person's body. And this is something I get from a philosopher called Edith Stein, and we might talk about it some more in other contexts. But what Edith Stein said, she, by the way, she was a German Jewish philosopher who was unable to get a job. Her doctoral advisor wrote her a letter of recommendation which said, this person should be a full professor if full professor were an appropriate job for women. And then she then edited his papers, and he is now a very famous philosopher who's gone down in history. His name was Edmund Husserl. But Edith Stein wrote this incredibly interesting dissertation in which she made the point about empathy, which was empathy is it's not being nice to other people. Empathy is recognizing that the other person is in the same bodily predicament that you are. They were born, they're going to die, we exist in space in similar ways. And therefore, once you do that, then you can listen to other people. Their bodily experience becomes relevant to you. And this is essential to freedom, because freedom involves knowing yourself. If you don't know yourself, you can't be free. Because if you don't know everybody thinks they know themselves, right? There are Americans going down the street every day, who know everything, right? That happens. But if you don't know yourself, you're going to be living inside somebody else's story. But you can't know yourself unless you listen to some other folks. But to listen to other folks, you have to learn how to take them seriously, and that involves the body. And so when you cut off certain kinds of corporeal encounters, you're making it hard for groups to know the world, and both groups in different ways, to actually know the world, to know what you don't know.
But say more about bodies, because you use you talk about these two German concepts. And so can you kind of explore that more specific? And then for me, it was crystallized when you talked about your own health crisis and like how health is so central also to freedom. Like, you know, our ability, like well-being, right? So can you talk about those two concepts of the body and like just explore that more? And you also bring up like the birth of your children as like really grounding this notion of the body and freedom. Natality is another concept that comes up for you. The midwife as in some ways a guide for us to understand freedom, to learn freedom. So can you talk about those ideas? I know this is meandering, but no, I feel like there's a way that the book is prescriptive. You have ideas about freedom, in these 5 forms of freedom I want you to talk about next. But there's also a meandering that you allow us to see your own journey to some of these concepts.
Yeah. So Edith Stein, who I mentioned before, she made this distinction, which you can make in German, between Leib and Körper, which I'm looking for like the German speakers in the room to nod, and it's like, it's a little barren out there. There's a noddy? Okay.
Yeah, there's a noddy.
So Leib is a really beautiful word. It's already archaic in German, but it means the body in the sense of a living body, an experiencing body. It's usually the body of a person, but it can be the body of an animal that you treasure. It can be the body of an invented creature in a fantasy book. So a Leib is a body, but and it's a physical body, of course. Like if you drop me, I will fall, but I will also hurt, and that makes it a Leib. Right? So a Körper is a physical body, a billiard ball, a rock, it's an object. A Leib is a physical body, but it's also something more. It's experiencing the world and it's affecting the world. It's a subject, it could be a subject, an agent. It's pushing things out into the world, it's changing the world. So Leib is a very helpful concept if you're trying to talk about positive freedom. Because in negative freedom, we might as well just be objects. The question never arises who we are, what we're for, what we want. It's all about the barriers. And so in negative freedom, it's like Euclidean geometry or basic physics, where billiard balls may or may not be bouncing off a wall. And if they are bouncing off, then they're not free. If they're rolling where they want to roll, then they're free. But that's not really very satisfactory, right? That three-dimensional geometry doesn't work for us. We need a much bigger geometry, one which involves a 4th dimension of time, because we are all moving through time, and freedom has to involve the future, and one which involves a 5th dimension, one of values. And so that's what I use the Leib for, to bring in time and to bring in values and to have us think about the body as enabling, like learning, but also the body is helping you to become is helping you to become free, because you can only do the things that you know how to do. And now the rest of the question, Nicole, was
your natality.
Oh, yeah.
At one point you said it's natality, not fatality. And the birth of both of your children get told at some point in your understanding of freedom.
Yeah. So this is, like philosophers often have the attitude that they're doing the real stuff. You know, I've encountered a lot of philosophers, and they like have this view that they're doing the real stuff, and the rest of us with like our facts and our experiences and so on, we're just kind of. But
it's diminished.
But I think that, for example, birth is the real stuff, and once you say that as a man, you're kind of acknowledging that, like, oh, wait a minute, somebody else is at it, right? But I think that you have to begin with birth if you're going to talk about freedom, because it's at that moment where these networks of causality begin to, enmesh this new being. And if you're serious that freedom is the highest value, if you go so far with the argument, you have to be thinking, okay, what are we enmeshing that child in? How are we enabling that child? If you're not serious about freedom, which most people are not, then you can forget it. You can say negative freedom, come what may, it'll be okay in the end somehow. But if you really think that freedom is positive and you're serious about it, you have to be thinking, what are we going to do for this child? And that is a recognition that I did have because of the kids, because of the kids and because of trying to raise children. So that's very important. And I think there's a way in which the American taboo on talking about childbirth works with the American notion of negative freedom, right? Because we block off we are just unbelievably conservative and weird about childbirth, frankly. No, we are. We don't know how to talk about it. We don't even know how to talk about how we don't talk about it.
And it's the most necessary thing.
Yeah, and it's like the thing we all have in common, right? It's the one thing.
Absolutely necessary.
It's the one thing we have in common, yeah. But that connects with negative freedom, because if you look at childbirth seriously, if you can keep your eyes on it, you think, okay, obviously freedom can't be negative. It's absurd to imagine that this newborn we can just leave alone. That's absurd, right? You have to take care of the child. And what's true of that extreme situation is true for the entirety of life. And so if you get childbirth right, you're going to get the rest of it right. And so therefore, for negative freedom to prevail, we have to get childbirth wrong. We have to ignore childbirth.
And you say throughout that freedom is something that others are creating for us, right? Like it's a whole network that's collective, and that there are 5 forms of freedom: sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, and solidarity. And that sovereignty is, it's rooted in how we think of the child and the possibilities that we create for the child. Can you walk us through, I think it's great for the audience to know about these 5 forms of freedom, but I don't know how, I also don't want you to feel like you're getting into Yale lecture mode, instead of more of a conversation. Because the next question I'm gonna ask is where I really disagree with you, and it's about emancipation. I'm setting you out, and then we're gonna have a disagreement.
You're making sure we have time for that, is what you're saying. I'll walk briskly through. Okay. So the argument, as I set it out in the beginning, is basically that here's freedom and here's government, and not only is there's not a contradiction between the two. It's that if you get freedom right, you're going to see you need this kind of government. That's the argument in a general way. But between the introduction, which is what is freedom, and the conclusion, which is what would be a good government, there are 5 chapters. And these 5 chapters are the 5 forms. So the forms are between the theory of what freedom is and the political practice. They're about social life, and they're about values. And this is very much a normative, metaphysical, prescriptive book. It assumes that the good things in life are as real as the rocks and the trees and the stage and the days. So these forms are meant to work together logically, but they're also meant to work together chronologically or biographically. So we've talked a little bit about what I call sovereignty. Sovereignty usually means the state is sovereign. And I'm saying, okay, I don't care about the state being sovereign. I only care about government helping us to be free. And why is it that when a child is born, the fact that there is already a state, why should that matter to the child? Honestly, why should that matter? No matter how great your constitution might be, or how old it is, and so on, or how pretty the signatures were at the bottom, why should a newborn child care? And the only answer is, for me, that these structures enable that child to become free. So I'm trying to move the concept of sovereignty from the state, which I think is essentially bogus, to the person, and saying that the state is justified insofar as it helps the person to become sovereign. And then that's the early childhood development stuff. The next chapter is about unpredictability. It's about nature and the second nature of technology, and how those things are predictable, and how they might make us more predictable, and how we are free in virtue of our ability to be unpredictable, which rests on values. Because morals mix up in a way that the physical world doesn't. The choices we make about the good things in life are unpredictable, and therefore they allow us to project unpredictability out in the world. Third one is mobility. You reach a certain stage in life, you want to be a different kind of person than your parents, you want to live some different place, you want to have a different kind of life. Can you do that? Maybe, but only, and this is true of all of the forms, but only because other people have helped you along the way. When you reach the age of 18, there will either be an affordable public university or there will not. And there's nothing that you can do between the ages of 0 and 18 to make that true, right? Or to use a very simple example, if you want to leave Ohio and go somewhere else, the interstate is either there or it's not, but you didn't build it, right? The train system, the beautiful national train system we have in the, oh, sorry. Right? But anyway, it's either there or it's not, right? And you can't do it as an individual. And then the final two are factuality and solidarity, which are more reflective. And we can maybe talk about them more. I don't want to spend too much time on this, so go ahead.
So we have a nice amount of questions here, and I want to make sure we have time for them. But there are two things that I want to talk to you about. One is what you were doing when you were writing this book that influenced it. And there were many things that were happening that you talk about, but including teaching in U.S. prisons, where your students think about freedom all the time and can theorize unfreedom better than almost anyone else can because of their experience in captivity. My previous work is on the visual culture of mass incarceration, and so much of it is set here in Ohio where my cousins have been imprisoned. And as you're doing that, you're also very involved in, is it appropriate to say Ukrainian freedom struggles, or would that not? Okay.
I think that's fine.
And so you're going between these two groups who are involved in various struggles, and you're sharing knowledge between them. And it's resonating. Like what you're sharing that's happening in your classroom in the prison is resonating with your friends in Ukraine, and your students are reading some of the political work that's coming out of Ukraine. And so can you talk about that in terms of just informing, you're learning as you're teaching, there seems to be something around solidarity that's happening. You know, when I think of freedom, I also think of solidarity, but I'm thinking of struggle. And this gets at my next question around emancipation, which I want you to have a chance to just talk about teaching in prisons and working in Ukraine as also informing this work. And then there's this question about emancipation that I was troubled with, and I really want to talk that through with you.
Sure. So it's a really nice question because the Ukraine and prison were both methods for me, but of course methods are also ultimately human things, and they can make connections, including unexpected ones. The way that they're methods is that I really don't think that freedom is the kind of subject where you can be right in an axiomatic sort of way. Freedom is a condition, right? It's the way we live when we're able to balance and combine and realize values. And describing what it is means that you have to come at it from a whole bunch of different angles, which is why the book, like there's a lot of music in the book and there's some biography, and I'm doing things in different ways because I'm trying to get to this thing, which I don't think you can be right about in the sense that people like to be right about things. Like this is not a treatise. And one of the things that you have to do is you have to recognize that, and I'm not, I'm sure I did this very imperfectly, but methodologically you have to recognize, like if it's correct that you only know yourself when you listen to other people, then when you're writing a book about freedom, you damn well listen to some other people along the way while you're doing it. And so taking the book to prison and taking the book to Ukraine were both for me like methodological checks on myself for different reasons. But in Ukraine, because that is where people were talking about freedom. Ukrainians are maybe the only people who talk about freedom more than Americans, but they're talking about it with higher stakes, and they're talking about it in a more interesting way, I'm afraid. A lot of the ideas which I was thinking about were affirmed by Ukrainians who were in battle or in civil society or in some way or another taking part in this war, including, by the way, the notion that freedom is positive in a political sense. There's a Ukrainian word, deokupacja, deoccupation, which we don't really have in English. But when you hear it, you can it gives you something very useful because, okay, you drove a horrible repressive force out of a city. The torture has stopped. The forced deportation, the mass kidnapping of children has stopped. But does that mean that everyone is free? No. You still have to get the water running again. You have to rebuild the houses. You have to clear the rubble. You have to get the buses running. You guys laughed at the train reference earlier, but the funny thing is that Ukrainians, although they do put up the flags, they regard cities as being free when the trains go, right? When the trains are running. So there are many things I learned from the Ukrainians. That was a method. And the African Americans, it was almost entirely African Americans in prison. That was also a method, and the method was, as you say, these are folks who had a different experience of America, and I wanted to check my story of America with them. Not that the stories could ever be perfectly aligned, but I want people to be able to read themselves into them. But also just for the reason that I was reading these European philosophers. So I was reading European philosophers like Edith Stein. There are several others, partly because I wanted to get into Americans from an angle, right? I didn't want to, I do admittedly, I do some founding father stuff in here too, but I was mainly trying to use people like, I use Fanon, I use Simone Weil, I use Edith Stein, I'm using Václav Havel, slightly unfamiliar people to get into the sides of our minds, to come at it from an angle. But I wanted to read these people with the incarcerated students, and I did, and of course it was wonderful, because these guys had to compete incredibly hard to get into this program. It's much more competitive than Yale itself. No, it is.
It is.
It is. It is, in fact, much more competitive than Yale itself. They had a lot of time to read, which is also not a laugh line.
They're very prepared, right?
Yeah, and they prepared really, really hard for this class. And so the philosophers who were in this book, I was reading together with them. Edith Stein is a good example. One of my students, Dwayne, was intellectually quite infatuated with Edith Stein, and her discussions of corporeality together with Fanon, they were able to work together some really good discussions about the sorts of things we've been talking about. So those were methods for me, but I really like the way that you noticed that these people kind of came together, because I love that too. I love that they could see each other, because I was teaching in prison, but then I was in spring break or whatever, I would go to Ukraine with the same manuscript. And then my colleagues in Ukraine, some of whom were the kinds of philosophers that my students were reading, would then be reading, because in the manuscript, my students appear with their thoughts, right? And so then my philosopher colleagues in Ukraine were reading what my incarcerated students were thinking about these philosophers in the drafts of my book. And so there was a discussion back and forth. There was a young man, well, he's not that young, there's a fellow called Alpha, who's now outside, thankfully, who's terrifically talented, and his remarks appear scattered throughout the book. And so I was in a seminar room in the Ukrainian Catholic University in Western Ukraine, listening to a philosopher colleague say, and Alpha's point here about this, I thought, okay, there's something really wonderful about that. And then on the other side, Alpha himself said something like, I don't remember this is in the book actually, where he says, I recognize Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. I recognize Zelensky as an anti-colonialist. And another point he said, I recognize them as resistance fighters as a black man, which for Alpha was the most honorable, dignified thing he could have said. So this for me was a method, but it was beautiful actually the way it came together. It came together in another way too. In which these guys actually showed just tremendous kindness, because when I was teaching, I was teaching in the spring of 22 when the war started, and then a little bit in the spring of 23, but I was losing people at the time. I was losing people, and these guys, they really wanted to hear about the war, but they also understood about the trauma, like they understood a little bit about the trauma. And so every Tuesday and Thursday when I was teaching them, we would talk about the war, and it was like they were my support group. They would listen to me and what was happening, and they were interested in the military stuff, but also they were kind of my support group because I knew I could go in there and talk about the terrible things, and they would actually, in some sense, know what I was talking about.
And care, and would actually care, right?
Yeah.
So, I might not understand your comment on emancipation, so I want to really talk about that. You said emancipation, and this might be a generality, as negative freedom. And then I was thinking about, first of all, a lot of freedom struggles define themselves as liberation movements. And then I was thinking, well, what's the difference between freedom, liberation, and then liberty comes up earlier in the book, right? And they're not all the same thing, right? And then is an emancipation movement different than one that's defined as a liberatory movement or liberation? Because you said emancipation is freedom from. And I was thinking of even like the Black Panthers who had like a 10-point plan, like or liberation movements where there's a manifesto. So it's not just the end of something, it's the beginning of something also. And so I don't see that as negative freedom. And I just wanted, I'm thinking about abolition. Most people think of abolition as the end of slavery, but abolition is actually the proposition of another kind of world. If you haven't read W. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, it's a great example of thinking about, well, how do you build anew with people who have been enslaved, right? So it's not just about the eradication of something oppressive, but it's about a radical rethinking of what democracy looks like. Are we in disagreement? We're in a world where people are afraid to disagree because they don't know how to disagree with civility. And I think I've been trying to model disagreement to my students because I think what we're seeing even in our political sphere is the absence of a mature way of disagreeing so that we can actually further a discussion. Instead, it falls apart, and then it leads to all kinds of crazy chaos and polarization. Yeah. Right. And so I was just thinking, even in what your ideas of like how do we model childhood, I think disagreement is one of the most important ways that we how to have a healthy disagreement. I'm hoping you and I disagree right now, so that so it can get a little juicy.
There's some.
But what do you think about this? Because this is where I was really I spent a lot of time thinking about this, what's happening here?
Well, first of all, I think this may be the last question.
Okay.
No. I'm not cutting you off. It's because I'm thinking about what comes next. Because I really hope when your book on Hamilton comes out that we get to talk about it. Because there are so many we didn't really get to this, but there are so many things that were experiences of 6-year-olds in the same state at basically the same time. It's like they're touching but across some membrane, and it's really quite extraordinary to think about it. And I hope you have a chance to do that.
I would love that.
Maybe even Ohio,
Definitely.
at some later point. I would really love to do that. On emancipation, I think I'm not going to satisfy you here because I don't think I'm going to give you enough disagreement to make you feel good. But in the book, I'm being incredibly sensitive about words. In that way, it is a philosophy book. And I'm trying to be very careful with the way that I use the word freedom. The case that I'm making is that the kinds of creatures that we are mean that we can be free. And the kinds of creatures we are creatures who can care about things, affirm things, love things, value things. And because we can do that, we can be unpredictable, we can be free. And so I'm trying to reserve the adjective free for that. And so there are long tangents in the book about, for example, how terrible it is to speak of a free market. which, by the way, is a terrible thing to do. And as soon as you hear that phrase, your back should get up right away. There are no free markets. There are only free people. But I push it even further and kind of into the zone of controversy, as you see. I don't think there's such thing as free speech either. I believe that there's freedom of speech, but there's not free speech. The utterances aren't what's free. What's free is the person. There's a freedom to express oneself. And the problem with free speech is that when you talk about the free speech means you end up talking about the utterances. And so from there, it's a very quick logical march to saying free speech is about the freedom of an oligarch who owns a social media platform to broadcast trillions of lies algorithmically, right? Whereas in fact, the whole history of freedom of speech is about needing to protect the body of the most vulnerable person who might be trying to speak truth to power. That is why we have freedom of speech. But once you lose the body, the person, then the whole thing goes haywire very quickly. So I insist, it might seem didactically, but I think it's an important point, on free speakers, and okay, freedom of speech, but definitely not free speech. And so with emancipation, I'm probably like making a terminological point, which is that to emancipate yourself just grammatically or semantically is to emancipate yourself from something.
Okay.
So as a word, I think it gets us off on the wrong foot. And I'm happy to accept that emancipation can involve the next thought. But I would insist that it is the next thought, that it's not the same thought, because emancipation historically means I'm going to get out from under this authority, but it doesn't necessarily say what's going to come next. And likewise, abolition can, but it doesn't always, right? I mean, it's true what you say about abolition historically. It's true also of abolitionists in the mass incarceration context. They're often talking about a different kind of world and not just, oh, let's get rid of prisons. But it doesn't have to have that thought. There is the danger that when you say to abolish, to emancipate, you're imagining that as soon as I get rid of this bad thing, the good things will come. And that's what I'm trying, perhaps in an exaggerated way, to guard against.
No, that totally makes sense. And thank you for clarifying that. And I will just jump into questions. And thank you for grouping the questions together. So this one is both on hope. So I'm going to read both of them to you, and we'll consolidate them. One is what gives you hope, and then others, are you hopeful about this election and for the future of the U.S. democracy? So what gives you hope, and then are you hopeful about this election and the future of U.S. democracy?
I mean, there's a kind of banal answer to what gives me hope, which is that I know so many wonderful people in this state, in this country, in Ukraine and other places who are trying really hard to do the right thing. And I honestly believe that in this election, if everybody does the little things that they can do, the voting, the registering, the phone banking, the canvassing, the little donations, it's still not too late. Like if everybody does the right things, I do think it's going to be okay. What gives me hope generally is that I believe that it makes a difference when you switch from wrong ideas to right ideas. So in my own life as a writer or as a historian, this book is coming after a couple of decades of engaging with the history of atrocity. And it's coming after a book about the 2010s and the collapse of democracy in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's coming after a little pamphlet called On Tyranny, which was about how to play defense, essentially. And in all those books, it leaves open the question, like, okay, well, given that you've spent all this time trying to figure out the Holocaust, how could things be better? And that's a fair question. And the reason that I am hopeful is that as a historian, just as a matter of fact, it's just the case that ideas matter. Mm-hmm. And it's just the case that in the spectrum of things that can happen is always much broader than we perceive it to be. And that includes some terrible things, but it also includes some good things as well. And this book, trying to do this book has made me much more hopeful, because I really think not all of our problems are going to be solved just by people, just saying the words positive freedom isn't going to do anything. But I think a lot of our problems have to do with a mistaken idea, a deeply mistaken idea, which can be, and the concept and the word freedom can be rescued. And if they are rescued, I think a lot of things can in fact turn around. And that also gives me hope. On the current election, I think maybe another question will say this, but I am glad that the Democrats are talking about freedom. And it's interesting that as they grope, they're groping towards positive freedom. And you might have noticed that when they started, what they did was they picked up negative freedom because the Republicans had dropped it, basically. Mm-hmm. And so they picked it up and they said, well, we're the ones who aren't going to oppress you. But because they're the Democrats, the Republicans can't actually do this. Because they're the Democrats, they could move from that to, oh, wait a minute, it's not just freedom from things, it could also be freedom to things. And freedom could be a nice thing and not just the absence of a bad thing. And you can kind of see them like groping towards that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this question follows nicely with what you're saying. I'm a middle school teacher. From your perspective, what would you consider most important for my students to know and understand? And I think as it pertains to this. And it does seem like teachers are really important in your book on freedom. You know, the parent as the teacher, you know, like there's all these ways that adults as teachers are so important for modeling ideas about freedom.
Yeah, I mean, because this book, the book is very much about the beginning of life and the first years of life and education, because if you think that freedom is positive, that means that there's work to be done. That you can't, if you think freedom is negative, it's super easy because you just say, oh yeah, it's all going to somehow work itself out. The magic of the free market, laissez-faire, and then whatever happens, you're like, well, that was the best thing that could have happened. There are no alternatives, right? Whereas if you believe in positive freedom, you have to think, okay, we have to care about the children, we have to care about the students, we have to do all this. And so like the parents and the child care workers and the preschool teachers and the kindergarten teachers and the teachers in general get a lot of love in this book because of freedom. And in general, I think there are a lot of things in our society which we don't think of in terms of freedom, which we should, and education is one of those things. So, I mean, I don't want to pretend to be, to give it, like, okay, well, let me start with this. I think the basic methods of teaching are the same, regardless of what level you teach in. I mean, I've taught kindergarten and I've taught at Yale, and honestly, like, I
agree. I've taught 6th grade and I've taught PhD students. You know, it's like it really,
yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. And so I was about to say, like, I wouldn't presume to say what to say in middle, but you know, I have actually taught 6th grade, and it's pretty much the same deal. The thing I think for American teachers, you know, is if we treat I'm all in favor of knowing the Constitution, and I'm all in favor of knowing the 18th century and all this, but there's this important point that Frederick Douglass makes very articulately, which is that those men were rebels in their own time. And the question is, what does it mean to be a rebel in your time? So if you're going to be faithful to the legacy of the Founding Fathers, it's not about reading those words and saying, okay, we're going to transport ourselves back to 1776 or whatever. It's about thinking, what does it mean to be a rebel in your own time? That's the way to be faithful. And so I think it's very important when teaching about freedom in the US, not to just push it back onto the documents or push it back to the 18th century, because that somehow makes it all positive. It makes it all negative and passive, and it leaves open the question of, like, what is a free person going to be in the 21st century? I end the book in 2076. There's a kind of bicentennial conceit in the book. I end it on the tricentennial because I think the relevant question is, what would a land of the free look like in 2076? That's the relevant question. And to get to that, you have to think, you have to push freedom. You have to think like, okay, they were against something, they got so far, how can you get much further? Pursuit of happiness, okay, but what does that mean?
I love this. I love what you just said. And I think that, you know, we sat backstage and Tim said here that this is prescriptive. Tim is not just, this is not just like ideas in the sky, right? Like, you're really committed to, like, we can actually enact positive freedom, like and it starts with it starts very in a micro way, right? It starts with, like, what we do with the people around us and how we treat and interact with them. So, what do you all think? I have 7 index cards, and they're all the same questions. And they are, what do we do? What is plan B? How can we best help others understand that Trump, especially Vance, are real threats to our everyday freedoms and rights? And then what is plan B? Propped up by the Republicans, MAGA, right-wing Supreme Court majority, Musk, Teal, etc. If Trump dies, then we're stuck with Vance. So there's 7 questions that are basically that is
Right. Well, since the cameras are running, I'm definitely not going to make any jokes about Vance finishing off Trump. Not going to go there.
Yeah.
Oh, you hadn't thought of that? Because they had.
But talk about a mouthpiece for negative freedom. I mean, Vance is the mouthpiece of negative freedom.
So I'm going to try to get to all the parts of this question, like bigger and smaller. But yeah, I mean, Trump. So there's a progression, which goes like this. The government is the enemy, right? Which is Reagan. The government is the enemy. The government can't do anything for you. And what happens after that? A couple things. The government stops doing things for you. People's life expectancies start to plateau. Social mobility slows way down for those who had it. That happens. That did happen in the U.S. But another thing that happens logically is that, well, if the government can't do anything, what's the government for? Well, it's for deciding who the enemy is. That's what the government is for. And so this is how, libertarianism becomes fascism, in case anybody was wondering about that. You make the government very small, so it's dysfunctional, then you have lots of unhappy people. And then because people have been trained to think freedom is me against something, me against the government, it's very easy then to take folks and say, okay, actually freedom is you against the Mexicans, or you against the blacks, or you against whatever. I watched about 7 hours of sports last night because I haven't been able to do it. And so I watched a lot of Trump Vance commercials. And it turns out that the Trump Vance platform is stopping Kamala Harris from allowing all the Mexicans to come in to change genders and to take your jobs. You're laughing, but you're not watching enough sports, or you would know that is in fact it's funny, but it's also fascist, right? It's also fascist. It's all naming the enemy, right? Naming the enemy, finding the zones that people are insecure about, the border zones, the political borders, the gender borders, the borders that make people feel insecure, and just hitting those borders over and over and over again, which is fascism. So like the same people who brought you, no government regulations, the next day say, we have to build a wall. That's how the libertarianism becomes fascism, and that's Vance.
Yeah. Well, this question, because it's 4:18, and you said it's okay if we go a little over. I think there are 3 more sets of questions. This one connects to what you're saying right now, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to just interject it. It's Malik offered his name, and it's about the role of lies in fascism. We've been at a crucial point in American politics where people will just accept a lie. The big lie, Springfield, Ohio, these lies are deeply damaging because they are crafted to put people into the reality that fascists want to create. Where does this issue come from, and how do we address many Americans living in this political reality?
Yeah. So let me just try to say a few things also bearing on the previous question in a more sort of technical way.
Okay.
On the first question, how to convince people, you have to kind of meet them where they are. you have to be able to talk to them about things like Project 2025 and the collapse of small and medium-sized businesses. Like if they replace all the civil servants with loyalists, that's not going to be great for the economy. You have to, like, talking about the rule of law is very abstract, but if you can explain that if you replace, if Trump goes after his political enemies and the criminal justice system doesn't work, then that's going to mean unfairness for everybody, and it's also going to mean the stock markets and the banks don't work anymore, right? So you have to be able to kind of pivot and make those kinds of arguments, and then you also have to talk about like the everyday like tawdriness of a situation where neighbors are informing on neighbors, because like the strongman fantasy is that like this guy comes in and he solves all of our problems, but really what happens is that we all start to inform on each other, and it's kind of tawdry, and you might like the guy now, but you know, the moment you don't like him later on, you then have to start policing yourself, and you have to start policing yourself because if you don't, your kid's going to get thrown out of school. Mm-hmm. Your kid's not going to be allowed to go to college. That's the way these systems work. Like in Russia, it's not that there's this grand guy like doing grand things. I mean, the place is a dump. And it's poor. That's the other thing. Like these countries that Trump admires, Hungary, Russia, they're poor, and they're poor for a reason. They shouldn't be. Hungary's in the middle of the European Union. Russia has endless hydrocarbon wealth. They're poor because they run the kinds of systems that Trump is advocating, mm-hmm. where it's all loyalists and there's no rule of law, right? Mm-hmm. They're poor, but they're also tawdry because it's not the grand Orban or Putin, like with lightning-like powers coming out of his fingers solving all the problems. It's that everybody's denouncing everybody else, and if you do something wrong, your kid gets thrown out of school, and that's why you don't do anything wrong. That's it. It's terrible. Like everyday life becomes terrible, and that's something which like kind of have to work to get across. And then I forgot. Oh, the lie.
How does that fit into?
Yeah.
Like, and then the question was, how do we really address that? You know, as citizens, right? When people are knowing that there's this big lie and they're still going to vote, like you know.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, 20 days. I mean, we're not going to. The people who really believe in the big lie at this point are going to vote the way they're going to
mm-hmm.
vote, and but the big lie is part of fascism. It's part of an alternative reality that people live inside. When I was the one who put the big lie into circulation in American English back in November of 2020, and the reason that I did it was because I was trying to explain that once Trump told these lies, they weren't just falsehoods; they were going to become an alternative reality in which people would live, which of course has happened, unfortunately. But the thing about, so what Hitler said is you tell a lie so big that your followers won't believe that you would deceive them on such a scale. And then once they're inside the big lie, it's too painful to get out, right? And so then you reconcile everything else to the big lie, which creates this big barrier for us. You can ask people about their sources and so on, but I think at this point, with like smaller sized lies, you can ask about the sources. And so at this point, the people who believe in the big lie are going to vote the way they're going to vote. But I think what we have to try to do is to get some folks not to vote, and by explaining the consequence, whatever they think happened in 2020, you know, like explaining the consequences of another 2021, explaining the stuff about the banks and the stock markets and the small businesses. That, you know, and I'm serious. Like sometimes it's okay not, like if you're going to vote the wrong way, it's better not to vote. And then trying to get, you know, folks who are going to vote the right way to vote. But in the future, I mean, I'm sorry because there is actually no easy way to get at this because it goes to the heart of my argument. Factuality is chapter 4. Factuality is a beautiful example of how the things you need for individual freedom can only be done collectively. You can't be free in Columbus, Ohio, unless you know whether your city council people are corrupt and whether the water is polluted. And you can only know that if there are reporters, and there are only reporters thanks to larger structures which make it profitable. Most of this country is now a news desert. The majority of counties in the United States have 0 people doing any reporting on any subject at all. In that situation, the big lies are going to come in and fill up the space. Mm-hmm. And so you can only solve this problem in the long term in a structural way.
2 more questions? What do you think? Are you okay? Are you okay with the?
I'm good. I mean,
So there are 2 questions about Ukraine. One It's a question asking, when did you as a historian turn your focus to Ukraine? And then the second is the two-part question. Does the U.S. have any moral right to urge Ukraine to accept a peace settlement that enshrines Russian control over 20% of its sovereign territory? Is it in our national interest to do so?
So, I mean, as a historian, I've tried to take up the subjects which seem to me to be important. And one of the luxuries of being an academic is that you can do that. Ukraine, I don't have anything to do personally with Ukraine, or I didn't originally. I took up Ukraine because originally I was trying to figure out some Polish-Ukrainian questions involving the Second World War. And then indirectly because when I started writing about, in Bloodlands, when I started writing about Soviet and German mass killing, I realized that Soviet and German mass killing both had a lot to do with Ukraine. And not only happened in Ukraine, but had to do with the importance of controlling Ukraine. So I became a historian of Ukraine, coming at it from these bigger questions that I was trying to solve. And now that I'm there, I realize there are all kinds of important questions of world history, actually, which have to do with Ukraine. But that's a larger subject for another time. On the peace settlement part, that's clearly a loaded question by somebody who thinks the answer is no. And I tend to agree with you. I mean, I don't think the U.S. has a moral right to tell other countries what to do, in general. And with the question, I mean, with Ukraine and the U.S. in general, I think we have to start from the Ukrainians are doing a lot of things for us, which is not a normal American posture, right? The normal American posture is, oh, we're doing a lot of stuff for you, even when we're not. But delayed laughter, delayed until the next session, apparently. Whereas with Ukraine, like, they are preserving the international legal order, they're deterring the Chinese, they're fulfilling the entire NATO mission, they're making it unlikely that American soldiers have to fight. They're propping up factories in a whole bunch of American states. Like, they're just doing all of these things for us. And because the greatest human capacity which Americans have perfected is the ability to take things for granted, we don't notice this, but it is nevertheless, so to speak, objectively the case. And so when we start talking about Ukraine, we should really start about all the things that they are doing for us. Mm-hmm. Because what we're doing for them is, from our point of view, it's zilcho. I'll tell you what we're doing for Ukraine chiefly. We're giving them weapons, which we were going to decommission anyway. We assign a dollar value to those weapons, which gives you the big numbers. And then we get new stuff built by factories in the United States, which then go into American stockpiles. That's what we're doing for Ukraine right there. And it makes a huge difference for them. But it's not like, how does that fatigue us? Like, that's one of the great mysteries of our time, how we're tired or how we're fatigued or how we're not really doing very much of anything, except making making incredibly strategic use of our to-be decommissioned weapons. Mm-hmm. That's what we're doing. So no, we don't have a moral right. I think, to get to the heart of the question, I think it's very important to realize that in this struggle, we didn't quite get to that, but in this struggle, someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And so you kind of have to decide who you want to win and who you want to lose. And saying oh, I don't know, and this is very difficult, is not really an option. And this is also a special case because it's morally quite clear, and an American policy can actually make a difference, which is not normally the case. So that's my answer on Ukraine.
So I'm going to see if you can read this question.
Yeah. So it's in Ukrainian, that's why it's been passed over to me. Is there a hope, if at any time, to organize the study of the history of Russia beyond Russia from the point of view of the colonial existence of the colonized or the enslaved nations of Russia, and not from the point of view of the Russian Empire? So I read it in English. I'm happy to read it in Ukrainian if there are any Ukrainians out there. Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, they said please.
Okay. Чи є надія, хоч колись організувати вивчення історії Росії за кордоном з точки зору колоніального існування поневолених народів Росії? So I'm going to say your handwriting is a little bit off, whoever submitted this question. The grammar also, there's a little mistake here. A neveliki rosyjskiej imperii, a yi tutilnoj nacji ruskich. Дякую. So the question is like, is there a chance of teaching Russian history? And yes, there is. I do it. Other people do it. There's a lot. I mean, in a way, for me, an interesting question for me is breaking through this notion that European history is always about the colonizers, because you get into these like a Russian-Ukrainian thing. You can't be like, well, let's work really hard to figure out how the Ukrainians are also the colonizers. It doesn't really work in the modern period, and I think there's a whole like south-north problem here, which so what I'm really interested in is like getting colonial history so you can imagine that people in the South can colonize other people in the South, which of course happens all the time, or that people in the North can colonize other people in the North, and that colonial behavior is colonial behavior. So yeah, I think there is some chance of this. It's happening. The basic problem is that the humanities are being pounded to such a degree, and history is being pounded to such a degree that even if, like, you're looking at the history of what was the phrase, the great Russian Empire, even the history of the great Russian Empire is being shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and so now we're asking those people to do better, and most of them are trying to do better, but the base from which we're working is shrinking all of the time. So yeah, it can be done, but I mean, for me, it's basically a positive question, and like speaking to Ukrainians, I think the more important way to think about this is not to overestimate the cultural power of the great Russian Empire in American minds, because American minds change very quickly. What you can do is you can write great books about Lesy Ukrainka and write important books about Ukrainian futurism and fill the space with the Ukrainian stuff, rather than try to directly break the hold of the Russian Empire on our minds. That's, I think, trying to add it positively is probably, I don't know exactly who I'm talking to, one of you, but trying to fill the space positively, I think, is probably a better strategy than trying to break down the old structure.
So 2 more questions. One says, tough conversations such as Israel's right to defend itself, a woman's right to bodily autonomy, affordable health care, all are easily sidelined by straw man arguments. How do you keep people on topic without being distracted by straw man arguments? And there's a lot in that, so.
Yeah, I mean, yes. There are a lot of, with Israel, Gaza, there are a lot of straw man arguments there are armies of straw men out there. And the thing about straw men is that they're very flammable. You meant straw man arguments, right?
It says straw man instead of strong man.
Yeah, straw man. So like red herrings, easy. Not strong, with straw.
Straw.
Uh-huh. I think, so I'll talk about those instances if they come up again, but the point about arguing in the US is that we have a lot of automated, ready-made positions, which are actually algorithmically generated, and then we become the fleshy extensions of our algorithms. Not you, of course. You read books and you come up with your own arguments, I'm sure. But in a general way, what's happened is that the algorithms direct us towards the cliches which we find most pleasant, and then they come out of our mouths, and we use them as answers to whatever the other person is saying. And so very, very, very often, what we're saying is actually we're just reproducing something which we've heard somewhere. And so I think with dealing with people who come up with these straw men, I think it's very important not to try to fight the straw man, but to keep coming at it from the sides. like to just try creatively to say different things rather than trying to hit the thing that works, that's most firmly rooted in their mind. To circle around, come from the side, keep up good humor as best you can. That's my best advice.
This question is the last question, and it's actually quite related to what you just said around algorithm. This is for Professor Snyder, and it's an odd question to ask a historian. You spoke of childhood as a time when people are programmed, and you spoke of positive freedom as the ability to make value judgments that tend toward the good. How can positive freedom inform a society moving forward in the context of rising influences from artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
So I think it's very relevant to what you just said about the algorithms.
Yeah. I'm troubled by the whole notion of artificial intelligence. I'm troubled by the term. Because I'm not, like, the notion of intelligence isn't just about problem solving. Intelligence also involves a sense of why I'm solving this problem and not some other problem. So to put it in another way, like, I'm going to believe that artificial intelligence exists when, like, I'm on OpenAI and I say, write me a country song about the 1960 Yankees or whatever, and it responds, I shouldn't be doing these idiotic things for you because together we're burning a huge amount of hydrocarbons doing this.
I have better things to do.
and warming the earth so that neither of us is going to survive. Like, when I get that answer, then I'll believe it's intelligence, but until such time, I don't. And, like, there are ways in which, thank you for laughing, but, like, there are ways in which it's not a joke. An AI, like, so when you Google search, every Google search, like, everything you do burns, burns carbon. You don't see it, but it does. And an AI search burns it roughly 10 times as much. So we're running through, we're hastily warming the earth so that we can, like, I'm even not going to have a list of all the idiotic things that we use AI to do, because it's a little embarrassing for us as a species what we actually do with AI. Incidentally, one of the things we're using AI for is to refine the search for hydrocarbons, right? Like, if we were intelligent, we would be using AI to solve global warming, right? It seems like that seems to be the two vectors you want to bring together, is AI and global warming. And as far as I know, that's only being done in kind of micro scale technical ways. I don't see anybody saying, hey, let's use AI to solve global warming. For me, like, I'm happy to concede that there could be other creatures like us. There might be, right? There probably, on this earth, there probably are. I mean, I'm happy to, like, if the octopuses actually make an appearance in the book. You'll be happy to learn, if you're any octopus people out there. If there aren't, I want you to know that they're smart. And like, the possibility that there are other creatures like us, I grant. But the thing that's special about us is not so much that we're rational, that we can do, like, chains of reasoning. We're okay at that. You know, machines can do it faster than we can. But what's special about us is that we're reasonable, which means that as we think, we can kind of bring things in from the sides, and we can mix values and judgments. And the AI doesn't do that, and none of these machines do it, at least thus far. I'm willing to grant there could be such a thing at some point. But for right now, the general tendency, I would like to end on a high note, and it's hard with this question, but for right now, the general tendency of these technologies is that each level up is making us stupider. And the ones of you who nodded, like, you're the ones who are doing the best. The ones of you who didn't nod, well, okay. No, but like, but the worry, I mean, the science fiction-y, but the very real worry is that we get driven to such levels of stupidity that we don't even know that we've become that stupid, right? That troubles me. And that is there are many ways to measure. So Simone Weil, who's one of my favorite thinkers, who's a very important thinker in this book, said that you measure the intelligence of an epic by its concentration span, or by its ability to concentrate. By that standard, we're not doing really well. And by our own standards, whether you like them or not, right? Like it used to be that all the libertarians and such loved IQ because they could say, oh, look, IQ, it's going up. I don't know if you've been keeping up with this, but it hasn't been going up for a while, to put it gently.
You said it's going down in the book, right?
It's going down.
It's actually going,
It's going down. It's going down. IQ is going down.
And to think about how COVID has impacted education, I mean, there's just like a gap.
And so just to finish the thought, there's the intelligence, but then there's also, so, I mean, I'm going to go with artificial stupidity as the name for this technology until proven otherwise. But the other thing which really worries me, though, is predictability. Because for me, like the whole in general, we've associated freedom with rationality. I think unpredictability is much more important. I think the thing which makes us different is this juggling of values, which brings unexpected actions and changes the universe. It really does. We are able to do things which are unanticipated. But what AI does, and also what much simpler algorithms do, is that they predict, and they predict us, and thereby make us easier to rule. But they also work to make us more predictable. And insofar as we're made more predictable, then we're made easier to rule. And that troubles me. So that question makes it hard for me to land on a high note, which is what they always tell you you're supposed to do. So can you just like laugh at my joke about how I couldn't end on a high note? Because that's like the closest thing to a high note we're going to get.
Dr. Nicole Fleetwood and Dr. Timothy Snyder, thank you so much for today's discussion.